Welcome to another Vinimark podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing a topic that has been called the fine wine debate, which has been going on in South Africa for some time. It revolves around trying to decipher the difference between good wine and the ever hallowed fine wine, if such a distinction even exists. So, to help us through the contentious topic, we have the CEO of Areni Global Wine Consulting, Pauline Vicard, to answer some questions about a report that has been causing quite a stir in the world's uppermost wine markets. Now, it's worth noting at the start of this chat that South Africa produces between 6,000 and 8,000 different wines each vintage. Plenty of these wines win international awards from institutions like Concours du Mondial or from the International Wine and Spirits Competition. And even more certain is that many a patriotic South African wine lover would be happy to put their head on a block and claim that South Africa produces some of the best wines in the world. And this is why it might shock these wine lovers to know that while there is no question over whether South Africa produces good wine, there is some doubt over whether we produce any fine wines. And at this point, one might say, oh, please, good wine, fine wine, nice wine. These are all just distinctions without a difference. Just another bit of marketing hocus pocus to try and justify exorbitant prices amongst snooty wine buyers. But global wine consultancy Areni Global have shown that this is simply not the case. And as I've said, they've released a study recently that very clearly shows that the difference between good wine and fine wine is very real in the minds of both consumers and retailers alike. So as I said, I'm going to chat to Pauline Vicard, who's the author of Areni Global's groundbreaking study, which was titled The Future of Fine Wine Consumers. And what we want to do is unpack a little bit about what fine wine actually means, how this definition changes from different markets around the world. But most importantly, we want to try and figure out how South African wines fit into this framework. So, Pauline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and what an introduction. Wow. I can't wait.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited to unpack all the hard work that you've put into this. Now, this fine wine study, it's the first of its kind. And I know that it took a huge amount of input and resources to produce. So, what were some of the driving forces and factors that made this topic, defining fine wine, so important to study right now?
Well, well, thank you. That's a great question to start with. I guess one of the drivers behind that study was simply that we are living in a changing world, and there's what we can see from producers to distributors. It's also a changing rules. Like I come from a winemaker family in Burgundy, and the way my dad saw his job as a winemaker 30 years ago is really different than what my friends of the new generation are seeing their job as winemakers today. And same thing in distributors and intermediaries and what was traditionally called middlemen. They're all rethinking their traditional job and what they had to do. And in order to adapt, because uncertainty and change didn't start with COVID. That's all those changing pieces were already there before. You need a bit of data, and you need a bit of insight, and you need to understand also who the consumer is and how you can adapt best to them, because the wine and fine wine industry has traditionally been very production driven. It was all about the wine, and nobody really cared that much about the consumer. So if we want to adapt a bit, we needed a bit of insight and data. So that was one of the main driving force for that report in particular. Getting some hard and quantitative data and qualitative data as well on who the consumer was, so that we can adapt our strategy all through the supply chain.
You had to do extensive interviews in order to confirm these definitions. And to do that, you must have already had some idea of who you wanted to interview. So, what were your thoughts before you began this topic? Before you started the study, how would you, Pauline, have articulated the difference between good wine and fine wine?
Well, well, then just going back to the study. So that study about the fine wine consumer is the first that we've done, but we didn't start with that. We started by defining fine wine, or at least trying to define it and put a definition together that we know is going to evolve and change. So we've interviewed like more than 200 members of the trade. We started with the trade first and tried to understand what fine wine was for the trade, and then we extracted from that definition components that we put to the consumer to see if the consumer had the same definition. So it was like kind of those two steps. Then for me, as anyone, I'd say, I had my definition of fine wine, which is very, similar to what I look for in the world. For me, fine wine, the difference between fine wine and good wine is fine wine that brings you beauty, respect, and wonder. So there's some sort of beauty that you aesthetic that you might not have. Respect echoes the sustainability part of my own definition of fine wine, the respect for the land, the respect for the people, both the people that do the wine and that drinks the wine, and that kind of wonder. So, when your eyes start to sparkle because you're very excited about that wine, and when you taste it, time stops, and then suddenly everything around you becomes a memory that engraves in your mind because it's that kind of magic sparkle kind of thing. So that would have been my definition of, of fine wine on a personal level.
Talking about those groups that you had interviewed beforehand, you mentioned you interviewed people in the trade. Can we drill down a little bit into that? What were the sort of positions and roles that you felt were most important to interview?
Well, we tried to be, I mean, the first round of interviews we had, like we interviewed 200 people around the world. So we tried to be balanced in interviewing, journalists, producers, distributors, sommeliers as well. And ask them what's fine wine for you. And we had definition that were from fine wine is a wine that has a value on the secondary market to definition like a fine wine is a wine worth talking about. The collective definition of Areni of what a fine wine is, and you have to have those four things. So it's not either or, it's all of that together. And to some extent, that's also for me what differentiate good wine with fine wine, because good wine can have, 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 4, but then fine wine will have them all. So the first pillar is about objectivity, like the taste of the wine, a bit like the Blick system that you learn through the WSET, the balance, length, intensity, complexity, um, and the capacity to go through time. So that ageability as well, that's quite important. Then the second pillar of the definition of fine wine is something which is more subjective, as I was saying, the capacity to stop time. So I wasn't the only one thinking that was that it was important for the definition of fine wine, but something that provokes emotions and wonders, which a good wine you might like, but it's not going to stop the time and make you remember everything that goes around you. Then the third one is the relationship with its maker and the fact that fine wine doesn't happen by mistake. That from the beginning to the end, the winemaker is really willing to do the best that he or she can do, that thrive for excellence, and also its expression of truth, because what the best can mean is also very personal. So it's that definition of their own truth that goes through their winemaking. And the last one, and that's the new one, it's about sustainability and the fact that the fine wine needs to be sustainably produced. So we could talk for hours about what sustainability means, but that was interesting to see that in the trade definition, it came in quite strongly in 2019.
Let's talk about that consumer group a little bit, because from what
Yeah.
I understand, there were various tiers in your consumer group. Now, how did you decide what those tiers or divisions? How did you decide what those divisions were
Well,
going to
we
be?
started. So as you've noticed, our first definition, the one that we've started with from the trade, there's no price point in that, and we don't say a fine wine starts at $50 or £50 or whatever currency. But when you have to do quantitative study, when you have to study the market with interviews and questionnaires more than face-to-face interviews, you've got to define the price, because otherwise people end up comparing pear and apples and then your data is not really worth it. So we had to tier the price that we wanted to study. And because that study was made in partnership with a negociant, the Place de Bordeaux, Mestreza, that I thank again for being so involved and helping us with that study, um, we actually, used the tier system that they've got in the Place de Bordeaux in terms of price. And when you look at the price, you understand very quickly. So it starts from €30 to 400 plus. and you understand very quickly that the consumers that you want to interview that will actually buy on a regular level bottles that are more than 400 euros, or all the very expensive bottles that we hear about, are not going to be your normal consumers. You will have to go and study the high net worth individuals, because of course, the price being what it is, you need to be very wealthy to access those bottles on a regular level. um, so then we've decided on two different methodology. We've studied, through wine intelligence. We had a series of questionnaires in the US, the UK, China, well, mainland China and Hong Kong. And then, because we know that high net worth individuals do not respond to questionnaire, we had a series of interviews and face-to-face interviews to actually see if the high net worth was behaving the same way as a regular, between bracket, fine wine consumer.
Did you have sub tiers within that range that you divided your consumers amongst?
People had to buy wines that were over $75 in the US, £50 in the UK, and 500 Hong Kong dollar or RMB in mainland China. And so, if they were not buying over those price points, then the questionnaire would stop, and we wouldn't continue to interview them.
Romantics are always wanting to say that quality and price are unrelated. Quality has to be something that can exist without necessarily being expensive.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I think we all agree that quality can exist without the skyrocketing price of like £10,000 a bottle. But I will have a hard time like talking to winemakers that would actually tell you that it's cheap to produce a fine wine, like it's cheap to produce the best that they can do. I mean, there's always more time involved in the vineyard. There's always more details, and more attention that is given to winemaking, and everything's really more precise. So that's more resources and more time. Fine wine doesn't happen by mistake or accident, which means that you are able to repeat that highest level of quality, and that expression of truth, of authenticity is a bit of a word that we hear all the time, but that expression of truth of what you think is the best that you can do. And when you talk to fine wine producers around the world, like, they spend hours questioning the viticultural practice, the winemaking practice, again, the attention to details, the attentions to the vine themselves, the attention to winemaking. It's just those little details. Everything from the beginning is thought after, and it's a bit more than just oh, look, those are the best barrel, let's put them together and have the best. When I was growing up, the paradigm of quality was blending. Like, a fine wine was blended, it was the Bordeaux model, blending different grape variety, because that was seen as one of the best way to achieve complexity. And now the Burgundy paradigm is here, which is it's only parcel selection that can give you the best quality. So of course we all learn and we all evolve. It's a bit it's a bit like cuisine and gastronomy. You've got a couple of recipes, and the further you grow and the further you learn from what you like to make and what the people like to eat, then you adapt. It's always a moving thing, and that what makes the wine world so exciting, to be fair, is those constantly adaptation and new expression of truth.
Yeah, and another thing I noticed about the results of your study was that the definitions of fine wine appears, at least amongst consumers, not just to change through time, but to change from place to place.
Yes.
And I noticed that around the world, qualities that make for a fine wine may be agreed upon in a market like China or Hong Kong, but would then be very different to, for example, the United Kingdom. Can you perhaps outline some of the differences that you found more noteworthy amongst the different markets?
It's interesting to see that across the four markets, there are some common traits. So, for example, again, that capacity to age everywhere. So it's very important for the consumer as well. It's not just a trade thing. And that consistency through time, also across the board, not just for trade, but also for consumers. And if you think also of that particular segment of the fine wine consumers that are collectors and investors, both the quality and the capacity to age is also important, because otherwise, how can you build a collection? How can you think about investing in wine if the wine doesn't go through time. Um, then the high ratings, but also the fact that it has high ratings and high score from the critics, were also across the board, across the four markets. And same thing to a different, with a bit of nuance, but the importance of region of origin. So fine wine is a wine that comes from a well-known, famous region of origin. Um, and then where it differs, and so there's a difference maybe between East and West, so the UK and the US on one side, and mainland China and Hong Kong on the other side. First, it was also on who the consumer was. So in the West, it's 70% male and 30% female. And in the East, it's really more balanced with 50-50 men and women. So it's the gender balance is better in Asia than it is in the UK and the US. And in terms of the fine wine attribute, the UK and the US were more responding to taste attributes, so like complexity of taste, where the Asian market was more about scarcity and the fact that it was rare, and given value to that particular um, attribute.
It's interesting that you mentioned regionality, or that one of the important factors was that a wine should have come from a famous region. I mean, when you're talking about regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, does South Africa have any regions that feature, in those conversations? I mean, you get to talk to some of the most discerning wine consumers on the planet. So, does South Africa ever pop up? Do we qualify in this realm of fine wine?
So when I talk to the trade, for sure. So when I talk to the trade, in the US, in the UK, not in France, because in France people there's not anything which is not French. So it's not just against South Africa. It's about anything which is not French. But so yes, the trade, yes, South Africa qualifies, and it's one of the region that the trade, the SOMs, for example, or the retailers are actually quite excited about. In terms of region, I think Stellenbosch, and the Swartland, and everything that's happening with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay around Hermanus as well is quite exciting for the trade. When it comes to consumers, so we haven't seen, when we've done the quantitative analysis, we haven't seen South Africa coming up as an origin. When we've asked people the origin of fine wine, we haven't seen South Africa appear. And when we've done the one-to-one interviews with high net worth individuals, they've said that they've considered South Africa. Most of them have tasted it. They have a bit of it in their cellar, but they still don't see South Africa at the same level. That it's more something that they experiment with, like they want to discover, and like they're happy to have from time to time. But yet, it's not part. Usually, like for example, for the collectors and the investors, they it's you've got Bordeaux, Burgundy, the super Tuscan, and some called Cab. In some ways, that's one world, and then you've got the rest of wines that can be interesting and good to taste and discover, but are not in the same bracket. I'd say they don't think about them the same way.
And Pauline, perhaps one last question, just for uh, you personally. I know this is not from the contents of your study, but I'd love to know, when you think about brand South Africa in the context of fine wine, what do you think are the opportunities that are most exciting for South African wine?
I think South Africa is in an interesting position at the moment because it can answer to what I see as two major trends. I discussed this when I was in South Africa with you in September, but I think it always helped to put a region on the map when they work with international varieties at a very high level, because that's how people compare and that's how people can actually place them. And the fact that South Africa is doing remarkable Bordeaux blend, for example. I know that people might not want to be compared with Bordeaux all the time, but it really helps putting a region on the map when you've got those blends at the level of quality. And that's one of the reasons for me of the success of the Super Toscans, because they came up with Bordeaux blend variety. So that's a big strength. And Chardonnay also, for example, I think the Chardonnay that you produce are really going to help South Africa. But you also have You also have local varieties or local expression of international varieties, of varieties that might not have been international before South Africa, like Chenin. It's really interesting for me as a French to see what South Africa has done for the French Chenin as well, and how for some producers it opened their eyes on different styles that they could produce in the Loire Valley, and also how in some ways the trade rediscovered the Loire Valley thanks to South Africa and the wonderful Chenin that you're doing. So that mix between indigenous grape variety or very very uh, pinotage also is can be really interesting because there's some fantastic pinotage out there. Um, that mix between working with international blends that allow you to be benchmarked on an international level, but also very individual and authentic again kind of winemaking that kind of answers different markets and different consumers what they can look for. So that diversity is something that I see as a big strength for South Africa. Now, how do you promote this collectively without losing the consumer, because there's so many diverse things? That's the challenge. um, how do you make sure that there's a collective approach? Because I don't see anyone going solo. I mean, again, unless you Penfold or Moët de Chandon and you've got huge budget to support that, to support you as a brand, there will always be a need for collective approach in fine wine, I suppose.
Well, thank you so much, Pauline. I can't wait to hear
Thanks so
more that
much for
comes out
having
of
me.
Areni. Yeah, I hope to be kept up to date with the future projects of the Areni Institute, just because I think what you guys are doing is so important in helping to connect both the producers of wine with the consumers.
Thanks so much, Jonah, for having me. It's been really nice talking to you.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.